I descended 5 miles beneath the North Atlantic in a submersible that felt more like a coffin than a vehicle. My knees nearly touched my chest in the passenger compartment, which was barely large enough for 2 people. The pilot, a stoic man who hadn't offered his name, focused on the control panel as we sank deeper into darkness. My contract papers crinkled as I shifted position. 6 figures. Annual salary with hazard pay. Room and board included. The offer had arrived 3 days after I'd been laid off from the offshore drilling platform, right when my landlord had started making noise about eviction. Research assistant needed for deep sea facility. No specialized experience required. 1-year minimum commitment. The listing had been vague about specifics, but the salary made details seem unimportant. Now, watching the pressure gauge climb as we descended further than any commercial diving operation would ever go, I wondered what I'd gotten myself into. First time down. The pilot broke the silence without looking at me. Yeah, most don't come back for a second tour. He tapped a gauge that was climbing steadily. 5 miles down changes people. I said nothing, trying to ignore how the submersible's hull creaked around us. My ears had popped so many times they'd gone numb. Outside the tiny viewport, nothing existed except absolute darkness, a black so complete it seemed solid. We're approaching Mariana Station. The pilot finally looked at me. International waters, no jurisdiction. Remember that. The first light I'd seen in hours appeared below us, a cluster of illumination that grew larger as we descended. The research facility materialized, a series of interconnected modules anchored to the ocean floor, looking impossibly fragile under the crushing weight of water. There she is, home sweet home for the next year. The pilot's voice carried no emotion. Hope you're not claustrophobic. The docking procedure took 20 minutes of precise maneuvering. Metal scraped against metal as we locked into place. A series of lights turned green on the pilot's console. Pressure equalizing, he said. Stand by. Water drained from the docking chamber with a gurgling sound that reminded me of a bathtub emptying. When the final light turned green, the hatch above us opened with a hiss. Welcome to Mariana. A woman's voice echoed from above. Please bring your personal effects and exit the submersible immediately. I grabbed my duffel bag, everything I owned that mattered, and climbed the ladder. My legs felt weak after hours of confinement. The woman waiting for me stood ramrod straight, her black hair pulled back so tightly it seemed painful. The name badge on her gray jumpsuit read Dr. Elizabeth Rodriguez, Director. Daniel Miller. Her tone made it clear she already knew who I was. Yes, call me Dan. She didn't acknowledge my preference. Follow me for processing. The submersible departs in 30 minutes. The realization hit me. This was my only way in or out for the next year. I glanced back at the hatch, fighting a sudden urge to climb back down and return to the surface. Mr. Miller, we operate on a strict schedule here. Elizabeth was already walking away. The corridor we entered was narrow with pipes running along the ceiling. The walls were off-white, stained with what looked like water damage in some places. Everything smelled of metal and disinfectant. Mariana Station operates with minimal personnel, Elizabeth said as we walked. You're replacing a technician who completed his contract last month. The facility serves as a research outpost for deep-sea studies under private funding. What kind of research? I asked. She ignored my question. You'll meet the rest of the crew shortly. We maintain a staff of 5 at all times. Director, engineer, medical officer, senior technician, and assistant. We passed through a series of pressure doors, each one making me more aware of how far I was from the surface. Elizabeth stopped at what looked like a small medical bay. Sarah will process your intake. A slender woman with a practical bob haircut looked up from a tablet. Her eyes were a piercing blue that seemed to look through me rather than at me. Medical intake for new personnel, Elizabeth said before turning to leave. When you're finished, bring him to the common area for orientation. Sarah gestured to an examination table without speaking. I sat down while she took my vital signs with methodical precision. Blood pressure elevated, she finally said, her voice clinically detached. Expected for new arrivals. Is it the pressure? I asked. Her eyes flicked to the observation window behind me, then back to her tablet. Adjustment period. You'll acclimate. She drew blood samples, checked my reflexes, and scanned my retinas. Each procedure was performed with minimal conversation. Medical history consistent with your application, she said finally. Cleared for duty. Follow me. The common area was a circular space with several doors leading off it. A table with attached benches occupied the center, bolted to the floor. A man with short black hair and a utility belt full of tools looked up from a panel he was working on. New blood. His smile seemed genuine if slightly forced. I'm Ryan Ortiz, station engineer and unofficial welcoming committee. He wiped his hands on his jumpsuit before offering one to shake. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. Daniel Miller. Dan, I corrected. Dan it is. Ryan's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, but I noticed they remained watchful. How was the trip down? Cramped. Gets easier. First week's the hardest. He glanced at Sarah, who had moved to stand near one of the observation windows. Sarah giving you the silent treatment? Don't take it personally. She saves her words for emergencies. Sarah didn't react to his comment, continuing to scan the darkness outside the thick glass. The final door to the common area opened, and a thin man with thinning brown hair entered. He nodded at me without making eye contact. Joshua Harris, he whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear him. Senior tech. He doesn't talk much either, Ryan said cheerfully. But he knows this station better than anyone. Been down here, 3 tours now, Josh? Joshua nodded, still not looking directly at me. Elizabeth returned with a tablet and a gray jumpsuit identical to what everyone else wore. Your quarters assignment and station protocols. She handed me both. Mr. Ortiz will show you to your bunk. Orientation begins at 0800 tomorrow. I suggest you rest. Without waiting for a response, she turned and left through one of the doors. Friendly bunch, I muttered. Ryan laughed. You caught us on a good day. Come on, I'll show you where you'll be sleeping for the next year. The sleeping quarters were utilitarian. 6 small rooms off a central corridor. Each contained a narrow bed, a desk, a chair, and a tiny bathroom. Home sweet home, Ryan said as he opened the door to my assigned room. Storage under the bed. Communal laundry at the end of the hall. Water's recycled, so keep showers under 5 minutes. I tossed my bag onto the bed. What exactly do we research here? Ryan's perpetual smile dimmed slightly. Deep sea phenomena. Pressure adaptations. Abyssal ecosystems. He shrugged. You'll get the official briefing tomorrow. I noticed a laminated sheet taped to the wall above the desk. Operational rules was printed at the top in bold letters. Ah, the house rules, Ryan said, his tone deliberately casual. Pretty standard stuff. Emergency protocols, shift rotations. I scanned the list. Most seemed like typical safety regulations for an underwater facility. But the first rule caught my attention. Never look directly into viewing windows after midnight. What's this about? I pointed to it. Ryan's smile remained fixed, but something in his eyes shifted. Light pollution control. Affects the natural behaviors of what we're studying. Before I could ask more questions, he checked his watch. Better let you get settled. Dinner's at 1800 in the common area. Don't be late. Sarah hates wasting food. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed, reading through the rules again. The first one seemed oddly specific compared to the others. I unpacked my few belongings, hanging the jumpsuit on a hook by the door. The station's constant mechanical hum was already giving me a headache. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of routine. I learned my duties, mostly maintenance, data entry, and assisting the others with their specialized work. Elizabeth remained distant and professional, answering questions only when they directly related to my assigned tasks. Ryan kept up his friendly facade, though I occasionally caught him staring at the observation windows with an intensity that contradicted his cheerful demeanor. Sarah barely spoke, spending most of her time monitoring equipment in the medical bay or watching the black water outside the facility. Joshua communicated almost exclusively through nods and whispers, his eyes always scanning our surroundings. No one ever mentioned the first rule again, and I noticed everyone found reasons to be away from windows after midnight. On my 15th night at the station, I was cleaning equipment in Lab 3 when I lost track of time. The digital clock on the wall read 23:58 when I finally finished calibrating the pressure sensors. I gathered my cleaning supplies, ready to head back to my quarters, when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails against glass. I froze, listening. The sound came again, more deliberate this time. It was coming from the main observation window at the far end of the lab. The clock ticked over to midnight. Common sense told me to leave immediately, but curiosity pushed me forward. The scraping continued, rhythmic now, almost like someone tapping to get attention. I approached the window slowly. The glass was thick, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of 5 miles of ocean. Nothing could survive out there unprotected, I reasoned. Nothing human, anyway. Standing before the window, I stared into absolute darkness. The exterior lights had automatically shut off at midnight, as they did every night. For a moment, I saw nothing but my own reflection in the glass. Then I saw it, a face pressed against the other side of the glass. Pale, almost white, with human features that were just wrong enough to send ice through my veins. Its eyes were too large, too round, fixed directly on mine, but it was the mouth that made me stumble backward, stretched impossibly wide in what might have been a smile or a silent scream. I blinked, certain I was seeing things, but when I looked again, the face was still there, watching me. A fog spread across the glass around it as though the thing were breathing against the window. That was impossible. Nothing could breathe in the crushing pressure outside. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. My elbow knocked over a container of cleaning supplies, the crash echoing through the lab. When I looked up again, the face was gone, fighting against every instinct that told me to run. I forced myself to approach the window one more time. The glass was empty now, but a smear of condensation remained, slowly fading around the edges. I placed my hand against the cool surface, feeling the lingering warmth where the face had been pressed just inches away from me, separated only by reinforced glass. The first rule made perfect sense now. I spent the rest of the night in my quarters, unable to sleep after what I'd seen at the observation window. The face lingered in my mind, those two large eyes staring directly into mine, that impossibly wide mouth. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it pressing against the glass, watching me. Morning came with the artificial lighting cycle of the facility rather than any natural sunrise. I dragged myself to breakfast in the common area, where I found the rest of the crew already gathered. No one commented on the dark circles under my eyes or my jumpy behavior as I poured a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "Rough night?" Ryan asked, his usual cheerfulness muted. I wanted to tell them what I'd seen, but something held me back. "Just getting used to the sounds of the facility," I said instead. Sarah glanced at me from her position near the window, her blue eyes assessing. Joshua hunched over his food, whispering something to himself that I couldn't make out. Elizabeth wasn't present. The day passed in a blur of routine tasks, checking gauges, recording data, cleaning equipment. No one mentioned my midnight encounter, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined it all. The rational part of my brain insisted that pressure and isolation could cause hallucinations. 5 miles underwater, the mind could play tricks, but I couldn't explain the smear on the glass or the lingering warmth I'd felt beneath my palm. That evening, I ate dinner alone in the common area. The others had already finished their meals and returned to their respective posts. I stared at the viewing window across the room, now covered with a mechanical shutter that automatically closed at sunset each night. Another rule I hadn't questioned until now. I returned to my quarters just after 10. My small room felt even more confining than usual, the walls seeming to press inward. I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the constant mechanical hum of the facility's life support systems. Sleep refused to come. The clock on my desk read 23:47 when I first heard it, a light tapping sound coming from somewhere near my head. I sat up, listening carefully. The sound came again, more distinct this time. Tap, tap. It was coming from the outer hull, just behind the wall where my bunk was positioned. I pressed my ear against the cool metal wall, trying to determine the source. The tapping continued, growing more rhythmic. Tap, tap, pause, tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. The pattern repeated, deliberate and measured. It reminded me of Morse code, though I couldn't decipher the message. My first thought was that it might be some kind of maintenance robot or automated system on the exterior of the facility. But as the tapping continued, changing its rhythm slightly, it became clear that whatever caused it was responding to my movements. When I shifted position on the bed, the tapping paused momentarily before resuming with a new pattern. When I placed my palm flat against the wall, the tapping concentrated directly beneath my hand. Tap, 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 tap. Something intelligent was out there, communicating. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of deep-sea creature using echolocation, or perhaps it was a previously unknown form of marine life trying to establish contact. The scientist in me wanted to respond to tap back and see what happened. I raised my knuckles to the wall, hesitating just inches from the metal surface. The door to my quarters burst open with a bang that made me jump. Ryan stood in the doorway, his face drained of color, eyes wide with panic. Before I could react, he crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed my wrist, yanking my hand away from the wall. "What are you doing?" I asked, shocked by his sudden appearance and the strength of his grip. "Don't." His voice was low, urgent. "Don't ever answer it." The tapping continued, more insistent now, as though whatever was outside knew it had our attention. Ryan reached past me and hit the intercom button next to my bed. "Elizabeth, we've got tapping in Section 4, Miller's quarters." Elizabeth's voice came through immediately. "All business." "Acknowledged. Stay with him. I'll alert the others." Ryan released my wrist, but positioned himself between me and the wall where the tapping originated. His typically cheerful demeanor had vanished completely, replaced by tense vigilance. "What's happening?" I asked, rubbing my wrist where his fingers had dug in. "What is that?" "Second rule," Ryan said, his eyes never leaving the wall. "If you hear tapping on the hull, never respond." I remembered seeing that rule on the laminated sheet above my desk, but hadn't given it much thought until now. "What is it?" "Some kind of animal." Ryan shook his head, still watching the wall as the tapping continued its persistent rhythm. 5 years ago, before my time here, there was a technician named Marcus Chen. Brilliant guy, from what I heard. One night he heard tapping like this in his quarters. The tapping grew louder, as if whatever was causing it wanted to interrupt Ryan's story. "He answered it," Ryan continued, his voice dropping lower. "Thought it might be some new species trying to communicate. He tapped back, established a pattern. For 3 nights he carried on these conversations with whatever was out there. He kept notes, tried to work out a communication system." Ryan finally looked at me, his eyes haunted. "On the 4th day they found him. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the facility's temperature. Found him where? Inside the water filtration system. His body was wedged into a pipe barely big enough for a child to crawl through. His lungs were completely filled with salt water, perfect seawater, not the processed water we use in the facility. But there was no hull breach, no explanation for how he got there, or how seawater filled his lungs. The tapping abruptly stopped as though the thing outside was listening to Ryan's story. The pressure sensors never registered any change, Ryan continued. The facility's integrity was intact. But somehow Marcus drowned in open ocean water while sealed inside a submersible research station 5 miles underwater. My mouth went dry. That's impossible. Yeah, well, a lot of impossible things happen down here. Ryan glanced at the wall as the tapping resumed, this time in a new pattern, faster, more complex. The working theory is that whatever's out there can manipulate water in ways we don't understand. Maybe it can push seawater through molecular-sized gaps in the hull. Or maybe it can control water inside the facility somehow. No one knows for sure because no one else has been stupid enough to answer the tapping. The intercom crackled to life. Ryan, is it still active? Elizabeth's voice was tight with tension. Affirmative, getting more insistent. Keep Miller away from the hull. I'm sending Joshua to assist. Ryan acknowledged the order and turned back to me. Some things in the deep ocean are better left unanswered, Dan. This facility exists in a delicate balance. We maintain certain barriers between us and whatever intelligence lurks out there in the dark. Break those barriers, and we all pay the price. The door opened again, and Joshua slipped into the room, moving with surprising agility for someone who normally seemed so hunched and withdrawn. He carried what looked like a small electronic device, which he placed against the wall where the tapping was most intense. Recorder, he whispered to me, his voice barely audible over the persistent tapping. Study patterns. Never respond. Joshua's eyes met mine briefly, and I saw genuine fear there. Not the nervous anxiety I'd observed in him before, but deep primal terror. The tapping changed again, becoming almost conversational in its rhythm. It reminded me of someone knocking on a door, politely but persistently asking to be let in. What does it want? I asked. Ryan and Joshua exchanged a glance. Access, Joshua whispered, the word hanging in the air between us. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her stern face even more severe than usual. We're moving you to temporary quarters for tonight, Miller. Bring only what you need for sleep. You can return in the morning. I grabbed my pillow and followed Elizabeth through the corridor to an empty room on the opposite side of the facility. The spare quarters were even smaller than my assigned room, with just enough space for a narrow cot and a small desk. Try to rest, Elizabeth said, her tone softening slightly. First encounter is always the hardest. What about Ryan and Joshua? I asked. They'll monitor the situation through the night. Standard protocol. As she turned to leave, I called after her. I saw something last night, at the observation window in Lab 3. Elizabeth paused, her back to me. What did you see? I hesitated, suddenly uncertain if I should admit to breaking the first rule. A face, pressed against the glass. It was almost human, but wrong somehow. She turned slowly to face me, her expression unreadable. The rules exist for a reason, Miller. All of them. Remember that. With that cryptic response, she left, closing the door behind her. I lay on the uncomfortable cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this section of the facility. Despite the distance from my quarters, I swore I could still hear the faint tapping, calling to me through the hull. Sleep was impossible. I stared at the ceiling, imagining what might be out there, 5 miles underwater where nothing should be able to survive. I pictured the face I'd seen at the window, those 2 large eyes staring into mine. I wondered if it was the same entity now tapping on the hull near my bunk, trying to establish contact. The night stretched endlessly. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke with a start to find Ryan standing over me. It's morning, he said, looking as exhausted as I felt. The tapping stopped about an hour ago. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Did you learn anything? Joshua's analyzing the recordings. The pattern changed several times throughout the night, became more insistent when we didn't respond. Ryan sat heavily on the edge of the desk. It knows you're new. They always focus on newcomers. They? I asked. Ryan shook his head. Figure of speech. Look, you should know the tapping might come back tonight. These events sometimes continue for several nights, especially with new personnel. I swallowed hard. What do I do if it happens again? Same as last night. You alert one of us immediately, and you do not, under any circumstances, respond to it. He stood up, his movements stiff with fatigue. Come on, breakfast in 10 minutes, then back to normal duties. But nothing felt normal anymore. As I followed Ryan to the common area, I realized the underwater research facility had revealed itself as something far more complex and dangerous than I'd understood. The rules weren't arbitrary safety measures. They were survival tactics developed through deadly experience. That night, I returned to my original quarters with dread settling in my stomach. The room looked exactly as I'd left it, yet something felt different, as though the space had been claimed by whatever had tapped on the hull. I lay in my bunk, staring at the wall, waiting. The facility grew quieter as the night shift began, and most of the crew retired to their quarters. The clock on my desk showed 23:30, then 23:45. At precisely midnight it began again. Tap, tap. The same deliberate rhythm, starting softly but growing stronger. I didn't move closer to investigate this time, but I didn't call for help either. I lay perfectly still, watching the wall, listening to the methodical tapping. Tap, 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 pause, tap, pause, tap, tap. The pattern was identical to the previous night, as though picking up the conversation exactly where it had left off. The tapping continued, growing more complex, almost musical in its cadence. It would pause occasionally, as if waiting for my response before resuming with renewed intensity. Ice-cold fear settled in my chest as I forced myself to remain silent. Hours passed, the tapping becoming more frantic, more insistent. It no longer sounded like knuckles on metal. Now it resembled the desperate scratching of fingernails trying to dig through the hull. I imagined the face I'd seen at the window pressed against the other side of the wall, just inches away from where I lay. Those two large eyes staring blindly at the barrier between us, that impossibly wide mouth working silently as its fingers tapped out messages I refused to answer. The scratching grew violent around 3 in the morning, as though whatever was outside had lost patience. The sound traveled along the wall up to the ceiling, then down the opposite wall, surrounding me completely. The entire room seemed to vibrate with its fury. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. I lay rigid in my bunk, straining to hear anything beyond the usual mechanical hum of the facility. The wall next to my head felt cold when I finally worked up the courage to touch it, much colder than the ambient temperature of the room. I didn't sleep for what remained of the night. When the lights automatically brightened to signal morning, I was already dressed and ready to leave my quarters, desperate for human company after the long hours of isolation. I understood now why the second rule existed. Some forms of communication were not meant to be established. Some barriers were not meant to be crossed. 5 miles beneath the North Atlantic, humanity maintained a precarious existence in an environment where we didn't belong, surrounded by intelligences we couldn't comprehend, and they were trying to get in. I spent the rest of the night in a daze after the tapping finally stopped. Every creak and groan of the facility kept me on edge. The morning came with its artificial brightness, making the events of the night seem distant but no less real. Over breakfast, the rest of the crew acted like nothing unusual had happened. Ryan talked about maintenance schedules while fixing a panel. Sarah monitored her tablet, occasionally glancing at the shuttered observation windows. Joshua ate his food in silence, eyes down. Elizabeth wasn't there. "Is this normal?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "The tapping, does it happen often?" Ryan looked up from his work. "Comes and goes. Sometimes weeks without activity, sometimes several nights in a row. And you just live with it?" He shrugged. "What else can we do? It's part of the job." The day passed in a blur of routine tasks. I helped Ryan repair a water recycling pump, assisted Sarah with cataloging medical supplies, and spent 2 hours entering data into the station's main computer. Nobody mentioned the tapping or the face I'd seen at the window. It was as if acknowledging these things might somehow make them worse. That night I returned to my quarters with dread in my stomach. I waited for the tapping to begin again, but the hull remained silent. The digital clock on my desk showed midnight, then 1, then 2. Nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next day passed without incident. No tapping, no faces at windows, no strange occurrences of any kind. Just the routine of an underwater research facility, or whatever Mariana Station truly was. I began to wonder if I might adapt to this strange existence after all. 24 hours after the tapping had stopped, I was helping Ryan calibrate sensors in the common area when a shrill alarm suddenly blared throughout the facility. The lights instantly shifted from their normal white illumination to a deep, pulsing red glow that bathed everything in blood-colored shadows. I jumped, dropping the tool I'd been holding. "What's happening? Is it a breach?" Ryan's hand clamped over my mouth with shocking speed. His eyes were wide and tense, filled with warning. He shook his head once, firmly, and pressed his finger to his lips. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of concentration. She made a sharp cutting motion across her throat, the universal signal for silence. Sarah and Joshua emerged from different corridors, both moving with unexpected stealth. Ryan slowly removed his hand from my mouth, his eyes still locked on mine in silent warning. I gave him a small nod to show I understood. The alarm cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the constant mechanical hum of the facility's life support systems. No one moved. No one spoke. The 5 of us stood frozen in the common area, bathed in pulsing red light. Elizabeth's eyes darted upward. She raised her hand, pointing to the ceiling directly above us. I followed her gaze and felt my blood turn to ice. Wet footprints were forming on the metal ceiling. At first I thought I was seeing things, a trick of the red light or my sleep-deprived mind. But as I watched, another footprint appeared, then another, moving in a deliberate pattern. They were human-sized and spaced as if someone was walking upside down directly above us. The prints continued their methodical journey across the ceiling, leaving glistening trails in the red light. Splash, splash, splash. Each new step forming out of nothing, water droplets occasionally falling to the floor below. The air around us grew colder. I could see my breath forming small clouds with each careful exhalation. Condensation began to bead on every surface. The walls, the furniture, our skin. Water droplets formed and ran down the metal surfaces, creating tiny rivulets that caught the pulsing red light. Still, no one moved. Elizabeth remained statue still, her eyes tracking the footprints as they paced back and forth. Ryan's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles working beneath his skin. Sarah's face was completely expressionless, but her eyes never left the ceiling. Joshua had his arms wrapped around himself, eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been a silent prayer. I wanted to ask what was happening, but the tension in the room was too great. Something told me that even the smallest sound might trigger a disaster. Instead, I stood frozen, watching the impossible footprints continue their journey. The pattern changed. The footprints began moving in tight circles, as if whatever made them was searching for something. They paused over each of us in turn, lingering longest above my head. I felt water droplets fall onto my face and fought the urge to wipe them away. The cold liquid traced paths down my cheeks like icy tears. Minutes passed that felt like hours. My muscles ached from standing so still. My lungs burned from taking such careful, shallow breaths. The footprints continued their relentless pacing, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing to an agonizing crawl. Then, without warning, the red lights switched back to normal white illumination. The facility's regular systems hummed back to life. The wet footprints vanished as if they had never been there, leaving only scattered droplets of water that pattered onto the floor below. Elizabeth exhaled loudly, her shoulders sagging with relief. "All clear," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud after the intense silence. Ryan picked up the tool I'd dropped as if nothing unusual had happened. "Let's finish those calibrations." Sarah returned to her tablet. Joshua slipped away without a word. The crew resumed their duties as though we hadn't just witnessed something that defied all natural laws. I couldn't let it go so easily. "What was that?" I asked, keeping my voice low despite the all clear. Elizabeth gave me a long look. "Red light drill." "Those were footprints on the ceiling." "Yes," she didn't elaborate. "But that's impossible." She raised an eyebrow. "Is it? After what you've seen at the window? After the tapping?" I had no answer for that. Elizabeth nodded as if my silence confirmed something. "Third rule," she said. "Stay perfectly silent during red light drills. Now you understand why. But what causes it? What makes the footprints?" Elizabeth glanced at the ceiling, now dry except for a few lingering droplets. "Something that uses sound to hunt. Something that can manipulate water and pressure to move through solid objects. Something that is very, very good at finding humans who make noise." She turned to leave, then paused. "The rules aren't arbitrary, Miller. They're the result of deadly experience. Many people died to establish these protocols. Remember that the next time you're tempted to break one." With that, she walked away, leaving me staring at the now ordinary ceiling. Ryan continued working nearby, pretending not to have heard our conversation. "How often do these drills happen?" I asked him. He kept his eyes on his work. "Often enough. More frequent lately." "And what happens if someone makes noise during one?" Ryan's hands paused for just a moment. "We had a researcher here about 8 months ago. New guy like you. During his first red light drill, he panicked, started asking questions, moving around." Ryan's voice dropped even lower. "We found him 3 days later in the water purification system. His body was completely dry, not a drop of moisture anywhere, like something had extracted every bit of water from his cells. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. That's not in the orientation materials." "No," Ryan agreed. "Some things you learn by experience, or by listening to those who've survived." I helped Ryan finish the calibrations, my mind racing. Faces at windows after midnight, tapping on the hull that couldn't be answered, wet footprints on ceilings during red light drills. Each rule connected to something that defied explanation, something that threatened our lives in this pressurized bubble 5 miles beneath the ocean's surface. That night, lying in my bunk, I reviewed what I knew. This wasn't a research facility, at least not in the conventional sense. We weren't studying the deep ocean, we were surviving in it, maintaining some kind of uneasy coexistence with entities that shouldn't exist. The rules weren't safety guidelines, they were terms of engagement in a silent war. I traced my fingers along the wall where the tapping had occurred the previous night. The metal felt normal now, neither warm nor cold. Whatever had tried to communicate with me seemed to be giving me a night's reprieve. "What are you?" I whispered to the empty room. "What do you want from us?" Only the mechanical hum of the facility answered me. But somewhere in the crushing darkness outside, 5 miles beneath the North Atlantic, something was listening. Something was walking on ceilings, pressing faces to windows, tapping messages on hulls, and sooner or later, I knew it would find a way inside. I woke early the next morning, still unsettled by the memory of wet footprints walking across the ceiling. My dreams had been filled with impossible images, faces pressed against glass, tapping fingers, and water that moved with deliberate purpose. Sleep had come in brief, restless intervals between long stretches of staring at the metal ceiling above my bunk. The facility had returned to its normal routine after the red light drill. Elizabeth went about her duties with her usual stern efficiency. Ryan maintained his cheerful facade while working on various systems. Sarah monitored her medical equipment with clinical detachment. Joshua whispered to himself as he moved through the corridors. Everything was back to normal, if anything could be considered normal, 5 miles beneath the ocean's surface. I had been at Mariana Station for nearly 3 weeks now, yet I still didn't fully understand its purpose. The orientation materials had described it as a deep-sea research facility studying abyssal ecosystems and pressure adaptations. But the events of the past few days suggested something far more complex and dangerous. After a quick breakfast alone in the common area, I decided to explore the facility more thoroughly. I had been so focused on learning my duties that I hadn't taken time to familiarize myself with the station's layout beyond the main sections where I worked. If I was going to survive a year in this place, I needed to understand it better. The facility was arranged in a roughly circular pattern, with the common area at its center. Living quarters, the medical bay, and the primary labs branched off from this central hub. I had spent most of my time in labs 1 through 3, which contained standard research equipment, pressure sensors, water analysis tools, biological sampling devices, and computer stations for data processing. Lab 4 housed the water recycling systems that Ryan maintained. Lab 5 contained communications equipment that connected us to the surface world through a complex relay system. Both areas were clearly marked and seemed to serve practical purposes for the facility's operation. But as I ventured farther from the central hub, following a narrow corridor I hadn't explored before, I noticed the lighting grew dimmer. The walls showed more signs of water damage, dark stains spreading across metal surfaces, and small patches of what looked like salt crystals forming in the corners. The corridor ended at a heavy reinforced door unlike any other in the facility. A small sign next to it read, Lab 6, non-operational. The door itself was at least twice as thick as the others, with multiple locking mechanisms and reinforced hinges. A small porthole window was set into its center, covered with what appeared to be specially treated glass. I checked the facility schematics I had been given during orientation. Lab 6 wasn't on the map. According to the official documentation, this section of the station didn't exist. I moved closer to examine the door. Despite its non-operational status, the locks appeared well maintained, and a small green light on the control panel indicated active systems beyond. Someone was keeping this area powered and sealed. Standing on tiptoe, I peered through the porthole window. The room beyond was dark, illuminated only by faint blue emergency lighting. At first, I could see nothing but shadows. Then something moved. Long eel-like shapes drifted through what appeared to be water-filled chambers. But that couldn't be right. The facility was pressurized specifically to keep water out. These sections should have been dry, like the rest of the station. I watched, transfixed, as the shadowy forms moved with deliberate grace through the blue-tinged darkness. They were longer than a person, with sinuous bodies that twisted and curled through the water with unsettling precision. I couldn't make out specific features, just elongated silhouettes gliding through flooded compartments that shouldn't have existed. Curious, I reached for the door handle and drew back in surprise. It was wet. Water beaded on the metal surface and dripped slowly to the floor, forming a small puddle. I touched it again, feeling the cool moisture against my fingertips. The door was supposed to be airtight, yet somehow water was seeping through. I brought my fingers to my lips, tasting the droplets without thinking. Salt. Not the processed water we used in the facility, but fresh seawater. Impossible given our depth and the filtration systems that processed all water entering the station. Movement caught my eye, and I looked back through the porthole. One of the eel-like shadows had approached the door and now hovered directly on the other side of the glass. Though I couldn't make out eyes or a face, I felt observed, studied with the same curiosity I was exhibiting. The shadow pressed closer to the glass, its form flattening slightly against the transparent barrier. I took a step back, uncomfortable with this proximity. As I moved, so did the shadow, tracking my withdrawal. It seemed aware of me in a way that went beyond simple animal instinct. "You shouldn't be here." The flat, emotionless voice made me jump. I turned to find Sarah standing a few feet away, her clinical gaze fixed on me. "I was just exploring," I said, trying to sound casual. "This lab isn't on the facility schematics." "For good reason." Sarah stepped closer, positioning herself between me and the door. Lab 6 is restricted access. It doesn't concern you. The door is wet, I pointed out. Seawater is leaking through. Shouldn't that be reported? It's not a leak. Her eyes flicked to the porthole, then back to me. Opening that door would cost you your ability to breathe. I frowned, not understanding. Is it flooded? A hull breach? No. Her voice remained emotionless, but her eyes held an intensity I hadn't seen before. Lab 6 contains something the previous research team discovered, something that requires permanent containment rather than study. I looked back at the porthole. The shadow was still there, pressed against the glass, seemingly listening to our conversation. What is it? I asked. Sarah's gaze never left my face. Something that doesn't belong in our world. Something that exists in conditions that should make life impossible. I noticed scratch marks around the doorframe for the first time. Deep gouges in the metal that ran in parallel lines as though something with claws had tried to force its way out from the inside. The marks were numerous and overlapping, suggesting repeated attempts over a long period. How long has it been in there? I asked, unable to look away from those marks. Longer than any of us have been stationed here, Sarah replied. The previous director initiated containment protocols after an incident that cost 3 researchers their lives. The shadow behind the glass moved suddenly, sliding quickly across the porthole and disappearing from view, only to be replaced by another, larger form that pressed against the glass with more force. The porthole fogged slightly, as though the creature on the other side had exhaled against it. They know we're talking about them, came a whispered voice from behind us. I turned to see Joshua standing at the end of the corridor, his thin frame hunched as usual. He approached slowly, eyes fixed on the porthole. They listen, he whispered. They learn. They wait. Sarah nodded. Joshua was here during the initial containment. He knows more about what's in there than anyone else at the station. Joshua stopped a few feet from the door, keeping a careful distance. Specimens, he whispered. Adapted to survive. Learned to mimic. Mimic what? I asked. Us. His voice was barely audible. Our movements, our behaviors, our patterns. They watch, they learn, they copy. But wrong. Always wrong. As if to illustrate his point, a shadow behind the glass moved in a way that seemed almost human, an arm-like appendage raised, pressing against the glass in a gesture that mimicked a hand. How did they get here? I asked. Were they brought to the facility for study? Joshua shook his head. They found us, came inside, through cracks too small to see. His eyes darted to the wet door handle. Water is their pathway, their medium. Sarah's clinical demeanor slipped for just a moment, revealing what looked like genuine fear. The 4th rule, she said. Never enter Lab 6, because whatever lives inside is waiting for someone to make that fatal mistake, Joshua whispered, completing her thought. I looked back at the porthole. Multiple shadows now crowded the glass, pressed against it as though straining to see us more clearly. Despite the dimness of the lab beyond, I could make out more details now, elongated, eel-like bodies that terminated in something approximating human torsos, with limbs that moved with unsettling flexibility. Not quite human, not quite fish, but some impossible hybrid that shouldn't exist. We should go, Sarah said, her clinical mask back in place. They become more active when observed. As we turned to leave, I noticed the puddle of seawater beneath the door had grown larger, spreading across the floor in our direction. The water moved with purpose, not following the natural slope of the floor but creeping steadily toward our feet. Joshua noticed it too. Don't let it touch you, he whispered, backing away quickly. Never let their water touch you. I stepped back, watching as the puddle stopped its advance, hovering at the edge of where we had stood moments before. After a few seconds, it began to recede, pulling back toward the door as though being drawn inside by an unseen force. What would happen if it touched me? I asked as we retreated down the corridor. Neither Sarah nor Joshua answered immediately. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice back to its clinical detachment. The same thing that happened to the researchers who discovered these specimens. Total cellular absorption. What does that mean? It means, Joshua whispered, they become you, from the inside. We returned to the central hub of the facility in silence. Sarah immediately went to the medical bay, while Joshua disappeared in the direction of the maintenance areas. I stood alone in the corridor, trying to process what I had seen. Lab 6 contained something the facility was designed to contain rather than study, something that had adapted to conditions that should have made life impossible, something that had learned to mimic human behavior and was waiting for someone to make the mistake of opening that reinforced door. I thought about the face at the window after midnight. I tried to sleep but kept seeing those eel-like shapes pressing against the porthole glass. My mind wouldn't stop churning over what Sarah and Joshua had told me about Lab 6. They become you, from the inside. The phrase kept repeating in my head as I stared at the ceiling of my quarters. After an hour of restless tossing, I gave up and went to review my notes. I'd started keeping a small journal of observations. partly to maintain my sanity and partly to make sense of this place. I opened to a fresh page and wrote down what I knew so far. Rule 1. Never look directly into viewing windows after midnight. Rule 2. Never respond to hull tapping. Rule 3. Stay perfectly silent during red light drills. Rule 4. Never enter Lab 6. 4 rules, each tied to something that defied explanation. Each a boundary between us and whatever existed outside in the crushing darkness. Each apparently written in blood. I closed the journal and rubbed my eyes. The digital clock on my desk read 1942. Most of the crew would be in the common area for dinner. Maybe some normal human interaction would help clear my head. The common area was quiet when I arrived. Ryan sat alone at one of the tables, picking at a tray of reconstituted food. He looked up as I entered, his usual smile missing. "Hey," I said, grabbing a food packet from the storage unit. "You okay?" Ryan shrugged. "Just one of those days, you know. Sometimes it hits you where you are." I heated my dinner and sat across from him. "I found Lab 6 today." His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Ah, Sarah mentioned you'd been exploring. Why wasn't it in the orientation materials or on the facility schematics?" Ryan put his fork down. "Same reason the rules aren't fully explained until you break one. Some things you need to discover gradually. That's not very reassuring. Wasn't meant to be." He pushed his tray away, food half eaten. "Look, I know how it seems. We're all keeping secrets, hiding the truth. But trust me, it's better this way. Too much information too fast. It breaks people." I thought about the shadows I'd seen behind the glass, the way they'd pressed against the porthole when they realized we were watching. "What are they, Ryan? Really?" He glanced toward the shuttered observation windows. "That's the wrong question. What's the right one? What do they want?" Ryan's voice dropped lower. "And why are they so interested in us?" Before I could respond, the facility's overhead lights flickered. Just once, a brief dimming that might have gone unnoticed if we hadn't both looked up at the same time. Ryan's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His body tensed, eyes widening as he checked his watch. "What is it?" I asked. He held up a hand for silence, staring intently at the nearest pressure gauge mounted on the wall. I followed his gaze. The needle was quivering, the reading dropping slowly but steadily. "Oh no," Ryan whispered. He stood abruptly, grabbing my arm. "We need to get to quarters, now. What's happening? No time. Move." He pulled me toward the corridor that led to the sleeping quarters. We made it halfway there when the first alarm screamed to life, a high-pitched wailing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. More alarms joined in, creating a cacophony that made my teeth hurt. Red warning lights began to flash throughout the facility. "Run," Ryan shouted over the noise. We sprinted down the corridor. I caught glimpses of other gauges as we passed, all showing rapidly dropping pressure levels. The facility itself seemed to groan around us, metal contracting and expanding with loud pops and creaks. Elizabeth appeared from the direction of the control room, her face tight with concentration. "To your quarters now. Get under your beds and stay there." "What's going on?" I gasped as we ran. Neither of them answered. Ryan shoved me toward my door when we reached it. "Get under your bed. Don't come out until the all clear, no matter what you hear." "But, 5th rule," he said, already backing away toward his own quarters. "When pressure drops suddenly, hide and don't move until it passes." The alarms continued wailing as I stumbled into my room. The metal walls were vibrating now, the whole structure making sounds like a submarine at crush depth. The pressure gauge by my door was spinning downward, approaching levels that shouldn't have been possible without catastrophic failure. I dove under my narrow bed without hesitation. The space was tight, dusty, and uncomfortable. I curled up on my side, trying to make myself as small as possible. The overhead lights flickered again, then dimmed to emergency levels. The facility creaked and moaned around me. Through the metal walls and floor, I could feel vibrations, rhythmic, deliberate pressure being applied from outside. Something was out there, something massive, pressing against the exterior hull. I heard a new sound over the alarms, a wet, sliding noise that seemed to move along the outer wall of my quarters. It reminded me of the sound a squid might make, dragging its tentacles across glass at an aquarium, except much larger. The sliding continued all the way around my room as though something was circling, testing the integrity of the walls. The intercom crackled. Elizabeth's voice came through, barely audible over the alarms and the groaning metal. "All personnel maintain position. I repeat, maintain position. Do not move until pressure stabilizes." The facility shook violently. I heard a distant impact, like something heavy striking one of the observation windows. Then another, and another. Each impact sent vibrations through the entire structure. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for several seconds before the emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in a dim red glow. The alarms fell silent, though whether by design or malfunction, I couldn't tell. In the sudden quiet, I heard it more clearly, the wet sliding sounds, They were everywhere now, surrounding the entire facility, multiple large bodies moving across every surface of the station, exploring, testing, searching. Something dark began seeping under my door. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but then it pooled on the floor with an organic, living quality. Not water, something thicker, darker. It spread slowly across the floor, moving with purpose rather than following the natural slope of the room. I pressed myself deeper under the bed, holding my breath as the fluid continued to spread. It reached the edge of my bed and paused, as though sensing my presence. Then it began to extend thin tendrils, probing the space between the floor and the bed frame. I remained perfectly still, watching as one tendril stretched toward my hand where it rested on the floor. The fluid was just centimeters away when the facility shook again, more violently this time. A tremendous impact struck somewhere nearby, the observation windows, I guessed. The sound of cracking glass echoed through the corridors. More impacts followed, each one making the facility shudder. Through the thin wall separating my quarters from the next, I could hear Joshua whispering rapidly, a constant stream of barely audible words that might have been prayers or calculations or both. The pressure gauge by my door continued its impossible descent. According to its reading, the pressure differential should have crushed us already. The only explanation was that our instruments were malfunctioning or something was manipulating the pressure around the facility in ways that defied physics. Another impact. More cracking glass. The dark fluid on my floor rippled with each strike, almost as if it were responding to the attacks. The tendrils withdrew, pulling back toward the main pool, which now began to move deliberately toward the ventilation grate in the corner of my room. The fluid poured itself into the grate, disappearing from view. I heard it moving through the ventilation system, a wet slithering sound that traveled throughout the facility. The intercom crackled again. "Medical report," Elizabeth's voice said, barely a whisper. "Sarah, report." After a moment of static, Sarah's clinical tone responded, also whispering. Multiple biological signatures detected outside the hull. Hundreds of heartbeats, all synchronized. A pause, then Elizabeth again. Location, surrounding the entire facility, concentrated near observation windows and water intake systems. The synchronized heartbeats sent a chill through me. I remembered the eel-like shapes in Lab 6 pressing against the glass. Were these the same kind of creatures, or something worse? Another impact shook my room. The cracking sound was louder now, closer. One of the observation windows was failing. "Engineering," Elizabeth whispered through the intercom. "Ryan, status." Ryan's voice came through, tense but controlled. "Hull integrity at 62%. Observation window 3 showing stress fractures. 2 minutes to critical failure if impacts continue at current force." My own heartbeat seemed thunderously loud in the quiet room. I tried to control my breathing, to remain as still and silent as possible. Whatever was out there, it was hunting, searching for a way inside. Joshua's whispered voice came through the intercom without being called. "Using pressure, creating differential, forcing micro cracks to expand." "Confirmed," Elizabeth replied. "They're trying to come inside." The wet sliding sounds returned, moving along the corridor outside my room. I heard a new sound joining them, something like fingers tapping against metal, but multiplied hundreds of times. It reminded me of the hull tapping from nights before, but more insistent, more coordinated. The facility groaned as the pressure continued to drop. Metal contracted, pipes strained, seals tested to their limits. We were in a pressurized bubble 5 miles beneath the ocean, and something was trying to create a pressure differential that would force entry through the smallest cracks. Time lost meaning as I lay under the bed, frozen in place. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The impacts against the observation windows continued but grew less frequent. The wet sliding sounds moved throughout the facility, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but never stopping. Sarah's voice came through the intercom again. "Heartbeats still synchronized, but pattern is changing, slowing." "Keep monitoring," Elizabeth whispered back. More time passed. My limbs grew numb from remaining motionless for so long, but I didn't dare move. The 5th rule was clear, and after what I'd seen with the other rules, I had no intention of breaking this one. The pressure gauge by my door finally stopped its descent. For several minutes, it remained steady at its impossible reading. Then slowly, it began to rise. The groaning of the facility changed pitch as the pressure started to normalize. The wet sliding sounds grew fainter. The impacts against the windows stopped altogether. The darkness that had seeped through the ventilation grate pooled once more on my floor, then retreated back the way it had come, as though being pulled by an unseen force. After what must have been 2 hours, the pressure gauge returned to its normal reading. The emergency lighting switched back to standard illumination. The intercom crackled one final time. "All clear," Elizabeth said, her voice returning to its normal volume. "All personnel report to the common area for damage assessment." I crawled out from under my bed, my body protesting after being still for so long. My legs wobbled as I stood, pins and needles shooting through my feet as circulation returned. I took a moment to steady myself, then opened my door. The corridor showed signs of the ordeal we'd just survived. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. Dark stains marked the walls where the fluid had traveled. Small puddles remained on the floor, though they were rapidly evaporating in the controlled atmosphere of the facility. I made my way to the common area, where the rest of the crew was already gathering. Ryan was checking a control panel, his movements quick and precise. Sarah sat at a monitoring station, reviewing data on her tablet. Joshua stood alone in the corner, still whispering to himself, his thin frame trembling slightly. Elizabeth looked up as I entered. For once, her stern demeanor had cracked, revealing exhaustion beneath. "Miller, you followed protocol." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "What was that?" "That," she said, "was why we have rules." Ryan stepped away from the control panel. "Observation window 3 has stress fractures, but the integrity is holding. Water filtration systems are functioning at 70% capacity. Environmental controls stable." Elizabeth nodded. "We've survived worse." "What were they doing?" I asked. It seemed like they were testing for weaknesses. "They were," Sarah said without looking up from her tablet. "Systematic application of pressure differentials against structural vulnerabilities. Coordinated attacks on observation points." Joshua's whispers grew just loud enough for me to make out. "Becoming smarter, learning our patterns, testing new approaches." A chill ran through me. This has happened before. Elizabeth met my eyes directly. "Fifth rule. When pressure drops suddenly, hide and don't move until it passes. Now you understand why." "But what are they? What do they want?" Elizabeth glanced at the others before answering. "They want inside. They want us. Beyond that." She shook her head. "Some questions don't have answers we can comprehend." Ryan finished his diagnostics and joined us. "The good news is they're gone for now. The bad news is they'll be back. They always come back." I looked around at their weary faces, seeing the truth I'd been slowly piecing together. "This isn't a research facility, is it? Not in the conventional sense." Elizabeth's expression hardened again. "Get some rest, Miller. We'll need to begin repairs in the morning." As the others dispersed to their duties, I stayed in the common area, staring at the stress fractures visible in observation window 3. Tiny lines spread across the reinforced glass like a spider web, evidence of the tremendous force that had been applied from outside. 5 rules. 5 defenses against something that wanted inside our pressurized sanctuary. 5 lessons learned through deadly experience. I thought about the contract that had brought me here, the promise of good money for a year of what I'd thought would be routine research work. Nobody had mentioned living in a besieged outpost 5 miles underwater, surrounded by entities that defied understanding. Ryan paused beside me on his way out. "First assault is always the hardest," he said quietly. "It gets, well, not easier, but more familiar." "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "These attacks?" "Since the first facility was established at this depth, 15 years, give or take. And we're just, what? Holding them off? For what purpose?" Ryan looked at the cracked observation window. "That's the question, isn't it? What's our purpose here?" He gave me a tired smile. "Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." I returned to my quarters, exhausted yet knowing sleep would be difficult. The image of dark fluid seeping under my door and reaching for me with probing tendrils would not leave my mind, nor would the sound of hundreds of heartbeats, all beating in perfect synchronization somewhere in the crushing darkness outside. 5 miles beneath the North Atlantic, I was learning the rules of survival, one crisis at a time. But I couldn't help wondering how long our luck would hold, and what would happen when these entities finally found a way inside. I stood in the common area, staring at the spider web of stress fractures spreading across observation window 3. The cracks caught the light from the overhead fixtures, creating patterns that reminded me of neural networks or river systems viewed from high above. My body still ached from the hours spent motionless under my bed while unknown entities tested our sanctuary for weaknesses. The facility hummed with a different tone now, the sound of systems operating at reduced capacity, of strained metal and compromised seals. The air tasted metallic. Recyclers working overtime to compensate for minor atmospheric leaks too small to trigger catastrophic alarms, but significant enough to alter the facility's carefully balanced ecosystem. Ryan moved methodically around the room, checking gauges and making notes on his tablet. Sarah sat at her monitoring station, eyes fixed on biological readings that scrolled across her screen. Joshua stood in the corner, his whispering momentarily silenced as he stared at the damaged window. The look on his face wasn't fear, it was recognition, like seeing an old enemy return after years of uneasy peace. Elizabeth entered from the direction of the control room. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, hair coming loose from its tight bun, dark circles under her eyes, uniform rumpled from hours spent in crisis management. She surveyed the crew, then the damaged window, her expression unreadable. "Status reports," she said, her voice steady despite her appearance. Ryan looked up from his tablet. Environmental systems at 83% and holding. I've rerouted power from non-essential areas to strengthen the electromagnetic fields around the hull seams. Sarah spoke without looking away from her monitors. Biological contaminants, negative. No evidence of intrusion remains in the water systems or air supply. Joshua simply nodded, indicating his systems were stable. Elizabeth turned to me. Miller, you held position during the event. Yes, I said, my voice sounding strange after hours of silence. I stayed under my bed like Ryan told me to. She studied me for a long moment. You've now experienced all 5 primary containment protocols. The rules, I said. There's one for each incident? Elizabeth glanced at the others, then made a decision. Follow me to the briefing room, all of you. We filed out of the common area, following Elizabeth through corridors bearing evidence of the assault. Dark stains on the walls, small puddles of evaporating liquid, hairline cracks in sections that had experienced the most stress. The facility felt different, as though the attack had altered it on some fundamental level beyond the physical damage. The briefing room was a small chamber adjacent to the control center. I'd never been inside before. Unlike the utilitarian design of the rest of the station, this room contained multiple screens mounted on the walls, specialized equipment I didn't recognize, and a circular table with 5 chairs. The centerpiece was a 3-dimensional mapping system that currently displayed Mariana Station in holographic detail, with damaged areas highlighted in red. Elizabeth sealed the door behind us and activated a security protocol on a wall panel. The lights dimmed slightly as additional systems came online. Sit, she said, gesturing to the chairs. We took our places around the table. I noticed the chair positions corresponded to our sleeping quarters locations within the facility, a detail that seemed oddly significant. Elizabeth remained standing, hands behind her back in a posture that reminded me of military briefings. Miller, she began, when you signed your contract with Oceanic Research Initiatives, you weren't told the complete truth about this facility. I gathered that, I said. The face at the window, the tapping on the hull, the footprints on the ceiling, the pressure attack. None of these fit the description of a standard research operation. Mariana Station was not established to study deep-sea ecosystems, Elizabeth continued. Its primary function is to maintain a containment protocol for entities that were discovered living in the abyssal depths 15 years ago. She activated the central display. The holographic image of our facility vanished, replaced by footage from what appeared to be an earlier version of the station. The timestamp read 14 years, 3 months earlier. The video showed an observation window similar to ours, but intact, without stress fractures. Beyond the glass was only darkness until exterior lights activated, illuminating a section of ocean floor. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just the barren landscape of the deep ocean bottom. Then something moved into view. Long, sinuous forms that resembled the eel-like shapes I'd glimpsed in Lab 6, but larger, more numerous. They moved with impossible grace through water that should have crushed any complex organism. As they approached the window, I could see they possessed features that defied biological classification. Parts that looked almost human merged with adaptations for extreme pressure, creating beings that seemed cobbled together from incompatible evolutionary paths. The first contact team called them abyssals, Elizabeth said as we watched the footage. The name stuck, though it's inadequate. They aren't simply deep-sea creatures, they're something else entirely. The video showed one of the larger entities approaching the window. It pressed against the glass in a manner disturbingly similar to what I'd witnessed after midnight. Its face, if that was the right word, contained elements that resembled human features but rearranged in ways that made no anatomical sense. Eyes too large and positioned wrong. A mouth that opened in multiple directions. Limbs that bent at impossible angles. Early attempts at communication led to disaster, Elizabeth continued, switching to new footage. This video showed the interior of a research lab where dark fluid seeped under a door despite apparent pressure seals. The fluid moved with purpose across the floor toward a researcher who backed away in terror. The video ended abruptly as the fluid lunged upward. 3 researchers were lost in that incident, Elizabeth said quietly. When the containment team arrived, they found no bodies, only evidence that the researchers had somehow been absorbed and transported outside the facility. Ryan leaned forward. That's when the first protocol was established, the midnight rule. Elizabeth nodded. We learned that the abyssals are most active during what we perceive as night hours. They're drawn to human observation. Direct eye contact after midnight seems to establish a connection that allows them to locate specific individuals within the facility. The face at the window, I said, remembering my own encounter. Yes, when you looked into that window after midnight, you were seen in return, marked. The implication sent a chill through me. That's why the tapping started in my quarters afterward. Correct, Sarah said, her clinical tone unchanged despite the disturbing subject. The second protocol was established after we discovered they can use sound to map the interior of the facility and locate potential entry points. Joshua's whisper was barely audible. Acoustic positioning, like bats or whales, but more precise. Elizabeth switched the display again. This time it showed brain scans, human on one side, something else entirely on the other. The patterns of activity were disturbingly similar despite the radical differences in structure. Their cognitive abilities surpass human understanding, she said. They've demonstrated problem-solving skills, communication methods, and adaptability that suggest intelligence at least equal to our own, possibly greater. But different, Ryan added. Thinking that evolved under 5 miles of water, under pressure that would crush a submarine. Minds that developed in complete darkness, in an environment we can barely survive in with advanced technology. I thought about the synchronized heartbeats Sarah had reported during the pressure attack. They worked together, coordinated. Elizabeth nodded. The third protocol, silence during red light events, was established after we discovered they can use sound to hunt. They manipulate water and pressure to move through solid objects if they detect noise. The display changed to show footage of wet footprints forming on a ceiling, identical to what we'd witnessed during the red light drill. The camera followed the prints as they moved across the ceiling, paused directly above a researcher who was speaking into a recording device, then suddenly plunged downward. The video distorted briefly, then showed only an empty room with a puddle of water on the floor. The fourth protocol regarding Lab 6 was implemented after we captured specimens for study, Elizabeth continued. We quickly learned they cannot be contained by conventional means. The specialized chamber in Lab 6 isn't just holding them, it's a negotiated space. Negotiated? I asked, confused. Sarah spoke up. Lab 6 serves as a kind of embassy. The specimens there maintain communication with the larger population outside. They remain voluntarily as part of an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? I asked, looking around at their serious faces. A treaty, Elizabeth said bluntly. The 5 protocols aren't just safety guidelines, Miller. They're negotiated terms that keep these ancient intelligences from claiming the facility and everyone inside it. The room fell silent as I processed this. The rules weren't just protective measures, they were diplomatic boundaries, terms of coexistence with something utterly alien yet intelligent enough to establish and respect conditions. Ryan stood and accessed a secure terminal on the wall. After your experiences with all 5 protocols, you're cleared for full disclosure. He entered a complex authorization code, then motioned me over. These are the sealed research files, he explained as classified documents appeared on the screen. Everything we've learned about the abyssals over 15 years of contact. The files contained hundreds of photographs, videos, and reports documenting encounters with creatures that seemed to exist at the edge of biological possibility. Some resembled the eel-like forms I'd seen in Lab 6, while others took shapes so alien I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. All showed evidence of advanced adaptation to extreme conditions and intelligence that manifested in ways both familiar and utterly foreign. They've learned to manipulate pressure systems, Ryan explained, pointing to footage of a previous attack similar to what we'd just experienced. They can create localized pressure differentials that should be physically impossible. They can mimic human behavior after observing it, though always with subtle wrongness that's hard to define. He scrolled to another file showing a facility similar to ours but clearly abandoned. Water damage marked the walls, equipment lay scattered as if hastily dropped, but no bodies were visible. Station Theta, Ryan said quietly. Lost 3 years ago when the crew violated Protocol 4. They tried to remove specimens from Lab 6 for more intensive study. Joshua appeared at my side, his thin frame trembling slightly. 48 hours later, response team found the station intact. No hull breach, no structural damage, but empty. Empty? I asked. Except for evidence, Joshua whispered, pointing to the footage as it showed clothing piled on the floor, still containing residual body heat according to the thermal imaging. They were there, then they weren't, taken while still in their clothes. Sarah moved to another terminal and brought up biological scans. We found trace DNA from the missing personnel in the water outside the station, cellular patterns suggesting they had been redistributed. The clinical term somehow made it more horrifying. I thought about the dark fluid that had seeped under my door during the pressure attack, reaching for me with probing tendrils. And the 5th protocol? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. The pressure attacks are assessment events, Elizabeth explained. They test our defenses, our responses, our adherence to the established terms. If we maintain position and don't interfere with their examination of the facility, they withdraw without breaching containment. And if we don't? Ryan's expression darkened. Station Gamma found out 5 years ago. One technician tried to repair a fracturing window during a pressure event. Sarah brought up the footage. A panicked technician applied emergency sealant to cracks forming in an observation window while alarms blared. The cracks sealed momentarily, then the entire window imploded. The rushing water didn't behave naturally. It formed a column that enveloped the technician and pulled him through the window opening that should have been too small for a human body. The pressure equalized almost immediately afterward, the breach sealing itself as if the water had been withdrawn by conscious control. I stepped back from the terminals, my mind struggling to process everything I'd learned. So we're not researchers. We're what, guards? Diplomats? Both, Elizabeth said, and neither. We maintain humanity's fragile treaty with intelligences that claim the deepest oceans as their domain long before we arrived. We observe, we document, and most importantly, we contain knowledge of their existence. Why? I asked. Why not tell the world what's down here? Ryan laughed without humor. And start a panic? Or worse, provoke military intervention? The abyssals have demonstrated abilities we barely understand. They can manipulate pressure, water, even biological matter. They can move through solid objects under certain conditions. What do you think would happen if governments decided they were a threat? War, I said, understanding dawning, with something that can turn our bodies against us and extract people from sealed environments. Exactly, Elizabeth nodded. Our job is containment, not just of the abyssals, but of knowledge about them. The world isn't ready. Joshua's whisper carried clearly in the quiet room. They were here first. Deep places belong to them. We are visitors, tolerated visitors. I looked back at the holographic display, now showing our damaged facility. So my contract is a commitment to maintaining the treaty, Elizabeth finished for me. Your work here helps ensure peaceful coexistence with entities we cannot defeat and barely understand. I thought about the lucrative terms that had seemed too good to be true. The hazard pay made much more sense now. Does the surface know? The company? Oceanic Research Initiatives is a cover, Elizabeth explained. The real funding comes from an international consortium of governments aware of the abyssal's existence. Only a handful of people in each administration know the truth. The weight of this knowledge settled on me, not just the existence of intelligent alien life in Earth's oceans, but my role in keeping that knowledge contained. I had signed up to be a research assistant, and instead found myself a guardian of humanity's most dangerous secret. What happens now? I asked. We repair the facility, Elizabeth said simply. We continue our work, we maintain the protocols, and we hope the treaty holds. Ryan placed a hand on my shoulder. It gets easier, not the fear that never goes away completely, but the purpose becomes clearer. What we're doing here matters. Sarah closed her terminal. You should review the complete files. Understanding what we face improves compliance with protocols. Joshua whispered something that sounded like knowledge is survival, then returned to his corner of the room. Elizabeth looked at each of us in turn, her stern demeanor returning. We'll begin repairs at 0600. Miller, you're on the environmental systems team with Ryan. Get some rest if you can. The meeting concluded, and we filed out of the briefing room. I paused at the door, looking back at the holographic display of our fragile outpost. 5 miles of crushing pressure surrounded us. Unknown entities with unfathomable abilities watched and waited beyond our walls. 5 simple rules stood between us and them, a precarious balance maintained through careful adherence to negotiated terms. I returned to my quarters, the knowledge of our true purpose giving new meaning to every sound, every shadow. My small journal lay open on the desk where I'd left it, the 4 rules written in my neat handwriting. I added the 5th. When pressure drops suddenly, hide and don't move until it passes. 5 rules. 5 boundaries between worlds that were never meant to intersect. I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the damaged facility around me. We balanced on the knife's edge between scientific discovery and survival in the crushing depths. And somehow I had become part of that balance, a guardian rather than a researcher, maintaining humanity's fragile treaty with the abyss.